And now here is Dennis Murray.
Good day to you. God bless you. Welcome to Shepherd's Chapel. Welcome to this family Bible study hour. We're ready to get back into our Father's Word, this fantastic book of Leviticus. You know, Ecclesiastes, the book written to the man that walks under the sun and tells us how to go through this life and be happy. Leviticus is pretty important in that respect too, in that we're finding out in this 11th chapter what we can eat and go through this flesh life healthy, rather than fighting different types of diseases, overweight, etc., etc. The Hebrew animal kingdom divided up into 4 categories: the land animals, the water animals, the fowls of the air, and then the swarming or creeping creatures, if you will. In our last lecture, we had covered the land animals pretty much. We'll go back to them in a few moments, but now as we begin our lecture today in Leviticus chapter 11, even these of them ye may eat: the locust after his kind, and the bald locust after his kind, and the beetle, is probably better translated a wingless locust, after his kind, and the grasshopper after his kind. And fact is, many times in the Bible it's listed the food of the prophets: locust and honey. Yum, yum. And actually, locusts are still eaten in a large number of countries around the world. Not so much probably as at one time, but they remove the legs and the wings and the head of them and either fry them or cook them in a flat griddle in butter, or boil them with salt and eat them that way. In fact, they dry them, the locust, to conserve them until wintertime in many cases, and they also grind them up into a meal. I didn't see any of the recipes that really appealed to me to the point that I thought I would have to try that tonight. 23. But all other flying, creeping things which have 4 feet shall be an abomination unto you. And only those listed as clean to eat. Verse 24. And for these, now this is referring back to the animals of the water that we started with in this lecture, and also the swarming, creeping animals in the last few verses. And for these ye shall be unclean. Whosoever toucheth the carcass of them shall be unclean until even, meaning until in the dusk or the end of the day, at which time, as a purification procedure in other places, as we'll see as we move through the book of Leviticus, would have required of washing with water at that time as well. And of course, a carcass being a dead body. Don't pick up the dead bodies of these bugs, is what this is saying. Or you'll be unclean until evening. 25. And whosoever beareth aught of the carcass of them shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the even, until dusk. A little further defiled if you have to carry the dead creature or dead animal, as we'll see also as it applies to the other animals, outside of the camp, for example, to get rid of it. Then that person not only would have to purify themselves at even by washing themselves, they would also have to wash their clothes. Why? Well, some of this, I think, relates to cleanliness. Remember, Israel's getting ready to move in to the promised land, into the land of Canaan, and God is teaching them the difference between clean and unclean. When it comes to dead animals and dead bugs, you talk about a way to spread disease in a hurry. It will, and I think part of what God is not only teaching the people cleanliness and morals, but also teaching them a complete abhorrence of death, anything to do with death. And as we move into chapters 12 through 15, we're going to see the defilements of the human body taken up. One of those, a great deal of time will be spent on being leprosy. And you talk about death and representative of sin. That someone with leprosy at that time was, and this time as well, it was pretty much a dead man walking, or a woman as the case may be. Now we switch gears years back to quadrupeds, meaning four-legged animals. 26. The carcasses of every beast which divideth the hoof, and is not cloven-footed, nor cheweth the bear, etc., among all manner of beasts, therefore those are unclean unto you. Whoso toucheth their carcass shall be unclean until the even, or until the evening, and then have to wash. 28. And he that beareth the carcass of them shall wash his clothes, and be unclean until the even. They are unclean unto you. Again, further defilement from carrying the dead body. And again, an example of why would they be carrying them? To get them out of the camp. 29. And here we come to again back to the fourth class, the creeping things. These also shall be unclean unto you among the creeping things that creep upon the earth. The weasel, and also known as a glider is how it translates really in the Hebrew, and the mouse, and the tortoise, which is a inflated toad, after his kind. All of these, by the way, often found in or around homes, dwellings at this time. And the ferret, this being a hedgehog, and the chameleon, and the lizard, and the snail, and the mole. Oh my, that's going to be unclean. There goes escargot. You know, escargot is not something I've ever even had the desire to try if someone was eating it at the same table I was, which happened in Europe one time in Germany. But anyway, I'll pass on the snails. That's not one of those I have any trouble living with at all. Verse 31. These are unclean to you. Among all that creep, whosoever doth touch them, when they be dead, shall be unclean until the even. And again, both of these words, unclean, in verse 31, probably better translated, most unclean. And again, we're talking about animals that were often found in and around homes at this time. In other words, especially close contact with where human beings would be, and more likely to spread contagious diseases. 32. And upon whatsoever any of them, when they are dead, and we're talking about the mouse, the snail, the mole, the weasel, and so forth in this verse, when they are dead doth fall, it shall be unclean. Whether it be any vessel of wood, I'm talking about utensils or bowls probably in the house with wood, or raiment, being clothing, or skin, any leather or hide, or sack, whatsoever vessel it be, wherein any work is done, it must be put into water, and it shall be unclean until the even, so it shall be cleansed. Any article of common use that one of these animals, a dead carcass, came in contact with, and actually that's not worded very well in the English there, where it was unclean until evening, and then it would be placed in water, just like someone, an individual who had defiled themselves. It's not that you put it in water and then you have to wait till evening for it to be clean. That doesn't make much sense. Verse 33. And every earthen vessel whereunto any of them falleth, whatsoever is in it shall be unclean, and ye shall break it. Not only did the dead body of this creature defile what was in the bowl, if in the case of an earthen vessel, it also defiled the vessel itself, and therefore it had to be broken. Just kind of at the other end of the spectrum of the sin offering, you recall back in chapter 6 and verse 28, where the priests were instructed that they would sodden or boil the sin offering, and if they did so, to eat it in an earthen vessel, that vessel was to be broken, not for the same reason here. The reason there in chapter 6 being that it had been in contact with most holy sacrifice, the sin offering, which the priest were to eat, and with the earthen vessel there, as with the earthen vessel here, it would absorb part of the most holy offering in the case of chapter 6. In this case here, the defilement of the carcass. 34. And all meat which may be eaten, probably better translated food, don't be just restricted to meat, but of all food which may be eaten, that on which such water cometh shall be unclean. And all drink that may be drunk in every such vessel shall be unclean. In other words, anything, oftentimes they didn't have, of course, they didn't have running water at this time, so they hauled buckets of water and put them in pots or whatever. And what this is saying is that if the dead creature fell into the water was unclean. And if it fell into any vessel that contained anything, that it was defiled and not to be drunk. 35. And everything whereupon any part of their carcass falleth shall be unclean, whether it be oven, and this is probably better thought of as a large pot used for boiling, or ranges for pots, they shall be broken down, for they are unclean, and shall be unclean unto you. And the range was 2 parallel racks, probably on a set of rocks that was used either to set up a boiler or a grill. But if one of these animals touched it, of course, what's a good, easy way for man to contact disease? It would be through what he eats. So has to be careful with anything that come in contact with these possibly diseased dead animals. And being put to us here, though, as unclean, not diseased. 36. Nevertheless, a fountain or a spring or pit wherein there is plenty of water, this in the Hebrew is a gathering of the waters, shall be clean, but that which toucheth their carcass shall be unclean. Or better, he who touches their carcass will be unclean. And I think what this is saying here is that if the dead creature came in contact with moving waters, running waters such as a stream or a river, that the water is not all defiled, but he that touched the carcass is definitely unclean. And then we switch gears to defilement of planting seed, 37. And if any part of their carcass fall upon any sowing seed, which is to be sown, it shall be clean. In other words, if the seed were dry, the embryo of the seed is not affected by the defilement. Once the seed is placed into the ground, and as the water germinates the seed, the earth absorbs the defiling or the uncleanness that came in contact with the outside of the seed. However, 38, but if any water be put upon the seed, and any part of their carcass fall up thereon, it shall be unclean unto you. In other words, the water would soften the exterior of the seed, and the unclean or defilement would penetrate into the embryo of the seed, and then defiling the fruit of it, unclean fruit of the seed, in other words. 39. And if any beast of which ye may eat die, in other words, if he dies by natural death, he that toucheth the carcass thereof shall be unclean until the even. And in other words, clean or unclean. We've already been told in verse 8 and verse 26 that the unclean animals were not to touch them or come in contact with them, but here the clean animals are also thrown in. Verse 40. And he that eateth of the carcass of it shall wash his clothes, more deeply defiled, and be unclean until the even. he also that beareth the carcass of it shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the even. And this law repeated in Leviticus chapter 17, verse 15, but there we'll have added to it that any animal torn of beast, meaning if it became the prey of an attacking animal and was killed in the process, it's unclean. And of course, in chapter 7, we were told that the Israelites were not to eat the fat of a clean carcass, a clean animal who died on his own, but that fat could be used for other purposes, such as making candles. 41. And every creeping thing, this again is swarming in the Hebrew, sherets, for the sheer multitude of them, that creepeth upon the earth shall be an abomination, it shall not be eaten. 42, whatsoever goeth upon its belly, and this would include worms and snakes, and whatsoever goeth upon all four, this again back I think to the rats, mice, and weasels, or whatever hath more feet among all creeping things that creep upon the earth, them ye shall not eat, for they are an abomination. I think that last one there, that hath more feet among all the creatures on the on the earth, would be insects. Verse 43. Ye shall not make yourselves abominable with any creeping thing that creepeth, neither shall ye make yourselves unclean with them, that ye should be defiled thereby. 44. For I am the Lord your God. Ye shall therefore sanctify yourselves, and ye shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall ye defile yourselves with any manner of creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. And a lot of people would say, well, people aren't holy, and you're right. But God called Israel to be holy in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. And verse 5, he said, if you will indeed hear my voice and obey it, and live by my covenant, then you will be a peculiar people to me indeed. And check out that word peculiar in the Hebrew. It means a highly guarded treasure. That's what God would like to think about his children, a highly guarded treasure. But then in Exodus 19, verse 6, he said, ye shall be unto me as a kingdom of priests and an holy nation. And that's what he wanted. Unfortunately, Israel at that time and we at this time, without figuring in the grace of us being under the blood of Jesus Christ in this dispensation, we sure have a tendency to disappoint our Father in a lot of ways. 45. For I am the Lord that bringeth you up out of the land of Egypt. I brought you, and he's appealing to the people here based on what he had already done for them. You were in bondage making bricks and building pyramids or whatever for the Egyptians. Whatever they wanted built, you were the slaves to perform the labor. I brought you out of that. To be your God, ye shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. Twice for emphasis. 46. This is the law of the beast and of the fowl and every living creature that moveth in the waters and of every creature that creepeth upon the earth. And kind of getting a summary of the health laws here. 47. To make a difference between the unclean, this in the Hebrew is tameh, and it means foul in a religious sense, and the clean, and between the beast that may be eaten and the beast that may not be eaten. Pretty plain. A lot of people wrestle with the fact of whether the health laws in Leviticus chapter 11 still applies. The human body has not changed, and God just created our human bodies. He knows what makes them tick. He knows how they can be healthy, and he knows what causes them to be unhealthy. Again, I think to violate one of these laws, the touching of the dead carcass, it made them unclean. But it was a pretty simple purification process. They were unclean until evening. Now that was a penalty in itself, because anytime anyone was unclean, that automatically excluded them from having any commune with God. They weren't allowed to go into the sanctuary, any part of it, even the courts. They weren't allowed to partake of sacrificial meals such as the peace offerings. If it were at Passover, they would have to skip that Passover and then take part in the second Passover, which, those of you that aren't familiar with that, you can read about it in the book of Numbers. It was for those that were out of the country or unclean at the time of Passover, which was began on the 15th day of the first month. Then they had to wait till the 15th day of the second month. But anyway, again, probably to violate one of these, sin that's going to send you to hell or the lake of fire, I don't think so. God is trying to teach His people as they're moving into the promised land. This is how you can be healthy and stay healthy if you'll follow these guidelines. So again, I think a sin against the flesh more than a sin against the soul. Okay, enough on chapter 11. Now we come to a set of chapters 12 through 15. We will be dealing with defilements of the human body. I probably want to warn those of you that watch the program with children that some of this has fairly mature subject matter. Is it X-rated? No, it's not X-rated, but my point is we're going to be discussing some fairly mature subject matter. Will I apologize for that? Absolutely not. It's not my place to apologize for God's Word. This is what the Lord wrote. And every word, as it's written in the New Testament, is good for our learning and our admonishment. And so with that, we're going to pick it up. Chapter 12 deals specifically with the defilement of childbirth. And as we move through 12 through 15, I think it's important to keep in mind that the wages of sin is death, as it's written in the New Testament. And these laws of purification, not only were they to promote cleanliness and to teach morals again, but to teach a complete abhorrence among the Israelites of death and everything to do with death. After all, our Father is not a God of the dead, He is a God of the living. So with that, chapter 12, verse 1, And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, verse 2, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, If a woman hath conceived seed and born a man-child, and she's had a son, in other words, then she shall be unclean 7 days. According to the days of the separation of her infirmity shall she be unclean. So 7 days after the birth of the son, she is just as she is in the days of her separation for her infirmity, which, if you'll check it out, is her monthly sickness. In other words, menstruation. And we'll come back and cover that. And believe it or not, there's a different set of regulations concerning the birth of a son and the birth of a daughter, and we'll cover that in our next lecture. Again, we're moving right along through this book of Leviticus. Y'all are doing good. I appreciate you sticking with me through it. Some of it's a little bit deep plowing, but we're going to make it. You hang tough, okay? We got a short message, and we'll ask you to listen a moment, won't you please?